Hi, everybody. I'm Melanie Wahlberg, and I'm speaking to you from my home office here in Southern California. And I'm so glad you all could join today. We're having an uncharacteristically cold, rainy day today here in California. And so I'm so glad to be able to join you all. There's nothing I would rather do than be inside with you all talking about big ideas. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about those ideas that aren't just exciting to think about, but that can actually transform lives. This Christian Science lecture is sponsored by First Church of Christ Scientist, Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you to those good people. And our title is Never Alone: How Spiritual Ideas Work in Us. Now, I know there's a lot of moving parts to that title. What are spiritual ideas? What's their source? How do they work in us? And how do they keep us from ever needing to feel alone or isolated from good or stuck? And so I promise to unpack all that as we get more into the talk. Well, I was so pleased to be invited to speak at the beginning of the year. It has kind of a fresh feeling, but 2020 was undeniably different. And I don't need to tell you all that we're still facing some unprecedented challenges. Folks have been adapting, certainly coping, sometimes just waiting to see what happens next. And that might sound familiar to some of us. I'm not sure. That can be kind of an unsettling feeling. Are we stuck with that though? I mean, are we stuck waiting? Or in other words, do things like the pandemic or rioting at our nation's capital in the United States, or racial inequality, or even the more general problems of things like loneliness or depression, do those define us? Or can we find something within ourselves, maybe something we didn't even really realize was there, that we bring to situations to be part of the solution, to be able to help and heal? I think even for people that feel a little stuck right now, we know intuitively that there's a way forward, a good way forward. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, this is not a talk on the coronavirus or politics or racial inequality. As important as addressing all of those is, I really want to be talking about a bigger context today. Sure, I expect that the ideas that we talk about today will give us something tangible to take to our homes or our families or our communities, to, like I said, to be part of the solution, to solve problems. But what I'm really hoping for is that we all can get a larger, a higher view, that changes our whole outlook and enables us to live a fuller life and even help others live a fuller life. And I don't think that's too ambitious for us to want from our time together here. So that's what I'm hoping for. What is it that moves us forward when we feel stuck? I mean, have you ever had a problem that you just couldn't seem to solve? That can be a lonely feeling, even if there are others that are trying to help us solve it. But then maybe you got just a little bit of inspiration as to how things could begin to go forward. It's not like we have to know how everything is going to work. Sometimes just becoming aware of the first step or two that we could take dislodges that stuck feeling and gives us the confidence to go forward. I love it when that happens. I think we all do. Well, today I'm going to be talking about something that's with us, that helps us with this stuff, that helps with the unsolved problems, and that can even bring inspiration and joy when things are going okay already. There's something with us that brings inspiration. And you know what inspiration feels like, right? I mean, it feels great. It lifts off that lonely feeling. It lifts off feelings of stress. It can even have a good impact on our health. It can even have a good impact on the health of those around us. And that's exciting to talk about. How can inspiration of our own change the atmosphere for everyone in a beneficial way? And that's something I think our world is just really crying out for right now. Well, this inspiration, as I said, can have just a tremendous impact. And I think leaders in all kinds of fields already know this. Leaders in education, the arts, technology, science, know the value of these bigger ways of thinking. I mean, they're really breakthroughs that change our paradigm. And I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about when I say that, change our paradigm. I mean, have you ever been really hoping for a solution to a little problem, and then you get some inspiration and it just kind of blows the lid off the situation in a great way? I mean, it changes our whole perspective. Sure, it solves the problem, but it even brings a feeling of joy and mastery and even some authority. It changes how we feel about ourselves when that happens. I don't know how many classical music lovers I have out there, but I think that the composer, Johann Sebastian Bach, often had that feeling of joy and quiet authority and mastery with his music. Once when Bach was complimented on his command of the keyboard, which we know was incredible, right? He said, "Oh, there's nothing so remarkable about it. All you have to do is touch the right key at the right time and the instrument will play itself." Maybe not at my house. Bach makes playing sound practically effortless. But I think that's because of what I was talking about. The inspiration that he was getting made him feel very close to or aligned with the science of music. The melody and the harmony and just how the notes could fit together. That felt very second nature to him. And I think it did give him that feeling of mastery. Well, my own practice and enjoyment of music has depended on my getting some of the same inspirations. I think some of the very same inspirations that Bach himself was getting into the science of music. Because the joy and beauty and harmony and rhythm, everything we love about music, isn't something that Bach invented. I mean, as remarkable as he was, it's not something that anyone invented. Really, it's more like what they discovered. That scientific possibility was already there. Well, the good news is that any ideas that move our lives forward this way towards more joy or mastery, ability, well-being, authority, are available to any one of us. And that's because they have a reliable source that's here with us, ensuring that we're never alone. So, what is this source? Well, I'm going to turn to Bach again for this. According to Bach, it's God that makes the music. One of his biographers translated him as saying that music has been mandated by God's Spirit. Isn't that lovely? Music has been mandated by God's Spirit. And I bet different ones of us could think of different words we might put in for music, dance or athletics or all kinds of things that we could put in. But Bach said music has been mandated by God's Spirit. It's as though he saw music as being designed to come to us and to happen through us. Well, music begins as an idea. And I like to think of God as the source of any good idea, not just the musical ones, but any idea that's timeless and a universal blessing. I mean, something that's as helpful to us here today that are gathered as it will be 100 years from now to somebody, on the other side of the globe. Now, I know that word God can evoke something a little bit different in each one of us. And so let me explain a little bit what I mean when I use that word. When I use the word God, I'm not thinking of a superhuman figure that makes arbitrary decisions about our lives, that blesses some people, but not other people. Because the Bible, especially the New Testament, puts forward a view of God as divine love. Just this love itself, this loving presence, or as infinite mind. I really like that one. The source of the ideas and inspiration that I'm talking about today, infinite mind. So when I use the word God, you can think divine love or infinite mind, and I'll do the same type of thing as I'm speaking. So ideas from God, ideas from love itself, are so inspiring and uplifting because they show us that everything that God made, including our own nature, including our own identity, is inherently good. How does that work? Well, when you get a new idea, you learn something about yourself. I mean, sure, you learn about whatever you were thinking about. Maybe you're helping your kids with homework and you both have an aha moment there, or you're doing a home improvement project and you realize a cool way to streamline your work or something. Those are great moments. But also, when a new thought stirs something in us, we can't help but learn something about our own nature, or I'd say about life itself. You start to recognize, okay, I'm feeling a connection here. I must not be just a mixture of strengths and weaknesses that's based on some limiting material substance. Actually, and the Bible indicates this, actually, we're like God, our maker, spiritual, pure, even when it doesn't seem that way. God is the universal divine parent. And as children of God, we're naturally kind and wise and capable, and ideas from God keep showing us this through the experiences that we have with them, those really good aha moment experiences. Now, those are different from the experiences that we have with the kind of dull or repetitive, even demeaning thoughts that we all seem to have to deal with on a daily basis. And I want to make a distinction here. Ideas that come to us from God show us bigger concepts of freedom. They show us the possibilities. They're expansive. You can almost feel it inside when you get that kind of inspiration. The thoughts that are mostly just reactions to the scene going on around us that may or may not be helpful or lasting or wise, those don't come from God. And they're not even innate to our own natural way of thinking, which flows entirely from God. And those reactions, I kind of call them like horizontal type thoughts. They come at you from both sides, but they're not coming from a higher source. Those reactions tend to move in circles, or even move us in circles. I mean, everybody here has probably had that discouraging experience of having the same few thoughts over and over again about a situation, where you're not making progress, but you're not quite letting it go either, just kind of feeling stuck. But we know the difference when we get spiritual inspiration. God's ideas, love's ideas, infinite mind's ideas do something. They move us forward in a way that the brain or self-will or that kind of horizontal force just can't. Ideas from God are really special that way. They're actually on a mission. And I love this concept. Ideas from God are on a mission to show us more of what we can do, to show us more of the good that's here already. They're on a mission to heal. And I say to heal because that's exactly what these ideas do. They stir something new in us. And it has a tangible impact on our life and even on our health. Let me give an example of that. How do ideas from God have a tangible impact on our health? A few years ago, a young mom called me for some help getting some of these spiritual ideas, some of these healing truths. Her 9-month-old baby girl had a rash on much of her body, including on her face, that just didn't want to budge. If anything, it was getting worse. And it had been there for several days. The mom was concerned about the appearance, as you might guess, but she wasn't convinced that a lotion or a powder or something like that was going to permanently solve the problem. And so she called for prayer. I think she also was just wanting a more joyful sense of life. But her main reason for calling was to take care of the baby. So one of the first things I wanted to do was make sure that this mom and I were open to the kinds of ideas that would bring the healing, that this family needed. And so we talked about that. We talked about wanting our thought to move, wanting our thought to be in a new place, getting that new outlook that I talked about, wanting our hearts to move. And we talked about the fact that love was right there to initiate that movement of thought. Maybe mind would be a better word to use there. Mind was right there to stir something new in us. Love was right there to shepherd us. and to give us that new outlook that lifts off that lonely feeling that parents can sometimes have when they're trying to make everything just right for their kids, or that would wipe out fear and doubt, and that would bring actual healing. And since we wanted to feel these ideas and see them transform lives, especially the baby's life, we didn't just talk about this, we prayed. Prayer is another one of those words that probably evokes something a little different in each one of us. So let me just say that when I use the word prayer, I'm not thinking of a certain set of words or surface level actions. Although, and probably many of us here today have prayers that we've memorized along the way. I mean, like the Lord's Prayer or some Bible verses, maybe something you learned when you were little, something inspiring you read online. Those are great. Those are good go-tos. But for today, I want to think of prayer in a broader way. It's really anything that helps us to tune into the good ideas that are coming to us from infinite mind and tune out fear and distraction. Prayer is humility, that's for sure. I mean, anybody that's ever tried to pray probably knows that you start out sometimes talking to God and you find yourself just gently moving into listening to God humbly. Prayer is, well, it's agreeing with the ideas that come to us. Instead of getting caught up in any discouragement or frustration that we might feel from what our eyes and ears are telling us, but instead agreeing with this flow of ideas that are coming to us from a larger perspective. Because, why can we do that? Well, more good, more energy or intelligence or wisdom, whatever's needed and whatever's God-based is available for any one of us to become more aware of in prayer. And greater awareness of these ideas from God wipes out feelings of fear and sickness and disease. And that's the connection. That's how ideas from God can have that very tangible impact on our health. In this case, with the baby, it seemed to me that clearer ideas of peace and joy and strength that I knew were innate to this little one could wipe out feelings of discomfort, the itchy rash, sadness, vulnerability. And when I say vulnerability, I especially mean, I'm thinking of the mom. I really wanted her to feel confident and peaceful and trusting in the prayers as we went forward. Well, I prayed along those lines for the rest of the evening, just cherishing this little one's innate peace and strength and comfort. And I know the mom was doing the same thing at her house. And the next morning, the mom called me to say that the baby was doing just fine, clear-skinned, good-natured for the first time in days. Although the only change had been our outlook, which was now more firmly rooted in ideas from God. I was delighted. I'm sure, I don't know how many of you have experience with babies, but when the baby's not itchy, the whole family's happier. So we were all really pleased with this. But there was more to the story, interestingly. Apparently, this mom had, for years and well before the baby came, struggled with binge eating. And it was something that she did by herself while her husband was home taking care of the baby. She would go out and buy all kinds of food and overeat, and then come home and go to bed and wake up the next morning feeling ashamed and alone, frankly. And she told me it was a miserable feeling, but she hadn't been able to stop, even with willpower, even though she had tried many times. But now she was telling me, you know what? Last night, after we spent the evening praying for the baby, for the first time in months, there was no pull to binge, no struggle. She said, actually, I felt inspired. I felt renewed. I felt this growing sense of purpose, both for me and for the baby. Well, what a welcome shift. I mean, what a hugely welcome shift. I think maybe while the mom and I were praying together for this little one, I think maybe the mom got just a glimpse of the value of this little girl in the world, letting her light shine as a child of God. And then I think maybe the mom saw something of her own value. Everyone's really having this same purpose in the eyes of an ever-loving God who never fails to see us as innocent and worthy. Well, she finished by saying, last night, after the baby went to bed, I went out and developed some pictures. I walked right past all those aisles of junk food and came home and went to bed. And when I woke up the next morning, I realized I felt free, loved, healed. And then she said to me, you and I weren't even praying about this addiction. I feel like the ideas did the work. And that was it. The ideas did the work. That morning, she didn't wake up feeling ashamed or alone. She said she felt loved, healed. She felt like ideas from God were at work in her life. And they were, new ideas relating to purpose, self-worth, health, identity were working in her experience. And by praying together with the Christian Science Basis for Healing, which I'm going to talk more about, we were able to watch those ideas transform her experience in real time. She began to eat normally without any special effort or willpower. And these days she has her own practice of Christian Science healing. And I know it's just really meaningful work for her to help others find the same kind of freedom. Well, I hope that mom's experience begins to show that we're never alone. God's ideas companion us. She wasn't trying to break an addiction. When she called me, she was, for her baby's sake, letting ideas from God work in her consciousness, maybe a little bit more than she ever had before, because she knew they bring healing and blessing. But, they also just feel good. They feel like home. They feel like love. They're the most natural place for us to land. Ideas from God aren't just those moments that revolutionize things. I mean, those are great. And we'll have some more of those in this talk. But really, ideas from God are part of every moment of genuine good in our lives. They're who we really are. And so those deep God-based ideas that our hearts just yearn for and connect with, like a purpose, love, health, beauty, creativity. Those are the building blocks of our lives. They're the reality. They're what move us forward. And then things that appear in our lives as limitation, like loneliness or violence, or when things are crazy at work, sickness, those don't move us forward. They couldn't be from love itself, right? They're not from God. They're not from love itself. And in that sense, they're not permanent realities. I mean, I know they seem to appear when we look at our life from that kind of horizontal perspective, but they're not part of who we really are. They're not part of our core spiritual identity. And so we're not stuck with them. And so healing then it's a shift in thought. It's seeing more of the good that's here right now available to us. It's not like we need to become something that we're not. And that's really helpful. If we're needing to do something new at work, some new project that seems kind of daunting, or if we need to repair a relationship, or if we need physical healing, we don't need to change reality. I mean, really, we're letting ideas from God show us more reality. And I think that's why I was so delighted with this mom's comment that the ideas did the work, because it brings the promise of ideas from God showing us good outcomes that we're not personally orchestrating. I didn't know anything about the addiction. I wasn't trying to stop an addiction. I didn't know anything about it. I was enjoying these ideas that were coming to me and that I knew were coming to the mom as well. And from that higher perspective, I got to watch her victory over this long, unnecessary habit. But I never felt like I was making something happen. And I think that's always the best way forward, the inspiration and energy and renewal that we can get from an idea from God. It's priceless. Now, having said that, I don't know about you all, but I sometimes find that the ideas can feel a little bit elusive. I mean, everybody here wants to be inspired. We love that feeling. How do we consistently find the ideas that transform our lives and enable us to transform the lives of others? It'd be nice if we had an example of somebody who did that, and we do. We have somebody whose life was so based on universally true, timeless ideas that 2,000 years after he said, "My words shall not pass away," we're still saying his words. And you probably know I'm talking about Christ Jesus. Because of the timelessness behind all of his counsel and the spiritual ideas behind it, many Christians refer to Jesus as the way. And that makes sense. I mean, his loving, unique example showed us the way to live lives that are entirely impelled by spiritual ideas. And to feel more of this good presence that's always here that I mentioned, that Jesus referred to as the kingdom of heaven. So, what can we learn from Christ Jesus' timeless, winning example of how to be consistently inspired, how to consistently find the ideas that transform lives? Well, I'm going to start with, or what I'd like to talk about is 3 bits of counsel from Christ Jesus' teachings. And I'm going to start with something from what many Christians refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. And I know I need to hold my book up high enough for you all to see it. I'm reading from the King James Version of the Holy Bible here. So, what can Jesus tell us about how to be consistently inspired? In the book of Matthew, Jesus said, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." Okay, what does that have to do with ideas? Well, first of all, the words hunger and thirst communicate an urgency to me. And that means that going after righteousness is worth our time. It's worth our devotion of thought. And second, we might think of righteousness as good, obedient living that's based on right ideas. But especially, I want us to just think about the good, obedient living that we're pursuing. When we do that, well, first of all, obedience is a little bit different to each one of us. It plays out in infinitely many good ways, but you know it when you're doing it. You know when you're putting love first before any self-centered desire. And when we do that, it's not always easy right in the moment, but when we do that, it brings such a feeling of childlikeness and innocence. Anything that is unlike God is just swept away in those moments. If there did feel like there was any obstacle between us and inspiration, it melts, it's gone. And the inspiration flows. And that's the connection. Pursuing obedient living, pursuing righteousness opens the channels for inspiration. It's a pretty simple idea. It's a pretty simple recommendation on Jesus' part, but it's very effective. It brings the inspiration. Second, Jesus exemplified humility. He was so convinced of the rightness of the source of the ideas, God, that Jesus was willing to lay aside any personal agenda or opinion, if he had them, and really seek new points of view in prayer. And again, he preached, and this is in the book of John, again in the New Testament, "My judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." I seek not my own will. That is humble. And that remarkable meekness, I mean, that's a lifestyle of meekness. And that enabled Jesus to feel and be moved by ideas that were shockingly new and bigger than society's lesser customs and traditions. And again, when we do that, when we let go of any personal agenda and really seek new points of view in prayer, we're able to let go of old, outgrown thoughts that we might not have even realized were there. And I am famous for that. I have done that many times and felt the the very tangible benefit. It creates space for the inspiration that we're craving. So the second one is humility. And third, Jesus taught the practice of trusting the ideas as they come to us and recognizing that they're practical for anybody. They're not dependent on any personal agenda or personal talent, I should say, or ability. And that's really good. Jesus said, I can of mine own self do nothing. Jesus said that. Well, a spiritual idea comes to us with everything needed to see it through. And that doesn't mean we're responsible for making it happen, but all the pieces are in place when the idea comes to us. And knowing that, just feeling that in his heart, enabled really good things for Jesus. I wasn't there, and I don't want to make it sound like I know exactly what he was thinking, because I don't. But I do feel like when a good idea came to Jesus, he didn't push back against it or feel like, I'm not ready, or I can't, or somebody else should. I feel like when he was inspired with an idea from God, he carried it out with the confidence that comes with knowing that you're supplied by God. And that enabled him to cure a disease that was considered incurable, for example, or permanently transform character, or restore what everybody else thought was lost, like the man with the withered hand or failed eyesight. There's so much more we could learn from Jesus, about Jesus, especially from reading the first 4 chapters or the first 4 books of the New Testament. But even just those 3 bits of counsel from Jesus' teachings: hungering and thirsting after obedient living, expressing humility, and trusting the ideas as they come to us, can teach us so much about how to be consistently inspired, regardless of our circumstances, really, whether we're alone or surrounded by people, whether we're struggling or thriving, whether we consider ourselves religious or not. It doesn't matter. No one is ever alone. The loving, healing presence of God working on our behalf is right with us. Ideas from God working in us, working for us. That presence is with us. And that presence has a very special name, and it's Christ. I've probably used that word a little bit already. The Christ presence just shone in Jesus' thought, as I was talking about, with his willingness to just go forward with the good ideas that were coming to him. And as a result, it's shown in his experience. And he was known by the title Christ because of the way he uniquely proved this presence of God with us. Well, the good news is this Christ presence is right here, right now. In fact, it says in the New Testament, we continue to share in all that Christ has for us, even in troubled times. And I'm going to give a couple examples later about how Christ just impelled somebody, almost without their knowing it, to do good works. I have a couple examples of those that I'll share. Well, someone who showed that this Christ presence continues with us in a very tangible way was Mary Baker Eddy. She was a more modern day seeker, more modern than biblical times, that experienced and proved really the everyday practicality of this Christ presence in a way that we all can experience and understand. Some of you might know that Mary Baker Eddy is the discoverer and founder, the discoverer of Christian Science and the founder of the church that practices its teachings. And we'll get a more fleshed out sense of her as we go on here. But no matter what you know or think about Mary Baker Eddy, one thing is pretty indisputable, and that is that she spent countless hours searching for the ideas that would enable her to heal herself and others. She had a rather sickly childhood and even into her adulthood, and that gave her the incentive to explore and experiment with the healthcare options of her day, which included homeopathy. That was the practice of giving a finer and finer dosage of a drug to a patient. Homeopathy, hydropathy, which was a water therapy, and allopathy, among others. Prayer and Bible study were constant companions as well. I think, especially because of her experiences with homeopathy, Mary Baker Eddy began to look at the role that thought played in finding healing. And this was a really long-term quest for her. In fact, she wrote in her autobiography, and I'm just going to paraphrase here, she said something like, during 20 years prior to my discovery of Christian Science, I sought to trace all physical effects to a mental cause. So you can really see the deep journey that she's on here mentally, looking for the cause behind everything that happens. Well, then, and I should say the mental cause behind everything that happens. And then as an adult, Mary Baker Eddy had an accidental fall that resulted in rather serious injury, but she was able to find the relief from the fear and even the pain after reading a biblical account of Christ Jesus instantaneously healing a man. And in time, she herself was completely healed. Interestingly, not just of the after effects of the accident, but of the decades of chronic ill health. That had a huge impact on her. I think it would have a huge impact on any one of us, but especially somebody who was trying to trace all physical effects to a mental cause. She really wanted to know how her healing took place. And in the process, her life began to change. I think, maybe like some of us, she had put years into turning to prayer for things like guidance and comfort. But now her healings brought her just the undeniable conviction that healthcare solutions could be found in Jesus' life and experience and works. Something she could use, something really practical, could be found in this larger understanding of God. Well, she felt like she had to write about this. And so she did in her book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. Hold that up too. She was in such a new place now, not only with her health, and I don't want to downplay that. Being healthy and able-bodied after decades of not being so enabled Mary Baker Eddy to travel and teach and preach in a way that wouldn't have been possible before. So that was definitely a game changer. But an even bigger shift was that of her faith. Mary Baker Eddy had grown up praying, reading the Bible with her family. They went to church together. I mean, they were believers. But now she writes in Science and Health, and she's speaking of herself. She writes, she learned that her own prayers failed to heal her, as did the prayers of her devout parents and the church. But when the spiritual sense of the creed was discerned in the science of Christianity, this spiritual sense was a present help. That spiritual sense is really what we're talking about today. And then she summarizes by saying, it was the living, palpitating presence of Christ, truth, which healed the sick. Well, that insight into the nature of God with us ultimately did enable Mary Baker Eddy to consistently heal herself and others. And she felt, of course, impelled to show the world how her discovery revolutionized human thought and experience. So why did she call her discovery Christian Science? I hope the Christian part is rather self-explanatory. Mary Baker Eddy grew up in a devoutly Christian household and really sought to follow in Christ Jesus' footsteps as closely as she could. The Bible was central to Mary Baker Eddy's life, and not just her life, her family's, and probably many of the people in her community around her, many of the people of the time, really, in a way that's almost difficult for us to understand today. And I mean this in the most respectful way, but it's almost like the Bible was Mary Baker Eddy's smartphone. Have you ever had a burning question and you find yourself almost without thinking grabbing your phone to look up the answer? Well, Mary Baker Eddy couldn't do that, of course, in the 1800s, but she could grab her Bible. She could and did grab her Bible and scour it for answers. And when you're so curious and receptive, the answers, especially if you have a good source like that, the Bible, just fly off the page. And so the Bible is just a very dear companion for her and very meaningful and practical. So that's the Christian part. A science is an organized body of ideas that are consistent and repeatable and provable. And it turns out that there is a science to the life of Jesus. There's a science just interwoven within all his words and works and examples. And Mary Baker Eddy's healings enabled her to understand something of this science, and she put her understanding into practice successfully. And then she wrote about her findings in her book. She shared them with the world in her book, Science and Health. This is the textbook of Christian Science. I'm going to hold it up because it, together with the Bible, these two books together, teach readers to heal themselves and others, and really to address even the liability to danger or sickness. Now, of course, the Bible is a timeless guide that's filled with God's word. It's filled with counsel directly from God. It also has many accounts of people having deep experiences with God that are educational or instructive for us today. And it has an account of Christ Jesus' healing ministry. Science and Health is a companion book to the Bible, and it shows the practicality of the ideas, particularly the healing accounts that are in both the Old and the New Testament, and how those healing works are practical and possible and appropriate today. In fact, the last 100 pages of Science and Health are letters written by people who were healed just by reading the ideas in the book. Healed by ideas. That can sound a little bit unusual, or at least for some of us, it can take some of us a little time to kind of wrap our heads around how an idea, again, can have such a tangible impact on healing, or even keep us immune and safe in the first place. How does that work? Well, this is a little oversimplified, but the best way I can share it is that ideas from God stir something new in us, sometimes before we're even aware. We know what it feels like, though. We know we like that feeling. And the more you have it, the more you crave it, I think. But ideas stir something new in us, and that changes our outlook, sometimes without our even realizing. And then as a natural consequence, our experience changes. For example, I might in prayer just spend a little time thinking about the God-given joy that each one of us has. And I know that's such a simple idea, but again, the Bible talks about our being made in God's image and God being totally good. So each one of us expresses countless God-like qualities. Let's think about joy for a minute. And I'll just think about how each one of us possesses that quality and how it just lightens our day, and let that idea just work in my thought a little bit. I'm not really doing anything. I'm just staying open to that. And then the next morning, I wake up a half hour early and get all my work done more quickly than usual, and have a little extra time to spend time with my kids or something. I know that's a very simple example, but that cause and effect is reassuring to me. I mean, it gives me a sense of how life works. And that mental nature of life, that mental nature of health, is not something that the news is necessarily talking about. But it's something that my family has experienced over and over again, many times. And we've relied on prayer and that sequence of ideas changing our outlook and changing our experience for contagious illness as well. I mean, times of cold and flu, and quick healing of chickenpox for my kids. And many Christian scientists, I would say, have done this as well. Many Christian scientists have found in their own experiences that prayer is a good place to start and is reliable for healing, because it doesn't just address surface level symptoms, but it really gets at the root, the mental root of issues, and dislodges old thoughts. It changes our paradigm. Like I was saying earlier, it changes our paradigm and dislodges unuseful thoughts, useless thoughts, that then creates room for the ideas of God to come in and work. We're not stuck. I mean, that's what I talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Are we stuck to wait and see? No, there's always something much more proactive we can do, even right from our easy chair at home, than wait and see what happens in the world or in our community. we're able to open thought to ideas from God and see what that stirs in us and our experience and our community's experience. And that's exactly what happened with the new mom. Her whole paradigm shifted when prayer uncovered some old, probably unknown beliefs that she had, in her case, about things like heredity or addiction, um, bad habits, nutrition, and wiped out all of that with a spiritual solution, which was feeling more of her God given worth and purpose. That night, she didn't have to talk herself out of overeating. Nothing like that was going on at all. Christ normalized her appetite. Her reaching out and being receptive to the ideas stirred something new, and that Christ presence normalized her appetite. It aligned her with what was most natural. And this is how the ideas can do the work. I think all of this begins to show, or I hope it does, that this Christ presence is reliable and does something. Sure, it's comforting to think about, but it's effective, and that's really what I want to talk about. On a personal note, Christ has enabled me to find an identity within myself that's so much better than I thought. I'm really grateful for that. And that is definitely a work in progress, but it's something I can be grateful for and am practically every day. It makes a difference. Christ shows us that we can love in situations where we have to think of others before we think of ourselves, or shows us that health and well-being is a natural part of who we were made to be. I think in the experiences that I've talked about so far, in these cases, I really had time to sit down and pray and give audience to God, give audience to Christ. But what about when we need to think and act quickly? Can Christ come through for us, or can Christ show us the way in those moments? We all have occasions like that. And once when I was in grad school, I got to see firsthand how God's ideas can quickly diffuse violence. And that just seems relevant to us all today. Let me give you a little context first. I discovered at an important meeting, the meeting was not violent, but I have to set it up. I discovered at this meeting that I had inadvertently neglected to document a certain aspect of my research. And I had for months neglected to do it. And I was really close to finishing my dissertation, which I had worked on for months. But it looked like this oversight on my part was going to just neutralize the whole thing. That was bad enough, but it wasn't just going to affect me. It was going to affect my husband as well. He and I had both planned on moving together. We were newlyweds, to a new location several states away, where we each had work waiting for us there. And if I didn't graduate on time, I wasn't going to be qualified for the job that was really taking us there. And there were plenty of other people right behind me in line waiting to take that job. And so I'm sitting there in this meeting discovering that I had goofed inadvertently for the last 9 months or so. And I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what to do in that moment. I just felt guilt and embarrassment. But after a couple agonizing minutes, it occurred to me, I didn't want to interrupt the meeting. And it occurred to me while I was sitting there, the one thing I could do would be to pray. And I could cultivate my God-given sense of innocence there. I could let go of the self-condemnation and listen instead to ideas from God. I talked about earlier how prayer is anything that helps us tune into these good ideas that were coming. And I sure couldn't repeat the prayers that I was making there. I think they were probably rather fervent, but it had to do with opening thought for better ideas to come to me. And I did that. And I won't go into the details of that now. It's not as interesting as the next part, but let me just say that the comfort and the new insights that came to me enabled a really practical insight that gave a quick resolution to the problem. And I was thrilled. I was absolutely thrilled. I never had to tell my husband about it. That was all neatly resolved. And I left that meeting just feeling on cloud nine, seeing everything through more trusting eyes. I wasn't alone. I had felt alone for a couple bad minutes in the meeting, but when I let that light pierce my thinking, I realized I wasn't alone. Christ had absolutely come through for me, cut through the guilt, cut through the self-doubt, even cut through my mistake, and given me a tangible solution. I hardly remember leaving campus that day. I just remember feeling acutely aware of this loving presence that was working on everyone's behalf. Even in the grocery store, where I stopped for some food on the way home from campus. But it was interesting, a couple aisles over, a fight was brewing. And I remember looking over and seeing these two tough looking young women that were engaged in a pretty heated argument. They were yelling insults at one another, being pretty mean, frankly, and it looked like it was about to get physical. The customers in the area just scattered. People did not want to get involved, or a few stopped and stared. Well, that whole situation, with the tension and anger and physicality was so at odds with the genuine sense of peace and joy and trust that I was feeling in my heart based on what had just happened earlier with me at that meeting. And, I knew that whatever had enabled a quick resolution for me at school, that same loving presence was at the grocery store as well, working on everyone's behalf. And it did not allow anger or rage or violence. And knowing that, I just found myself approaching the two women. You know how sometimes you see a situation, you think, oh, should I do something? Or I don't know if I want to get involved. I didn't feel that at all. I didn't feel that sense of self-consciousness that I sometimes do. I just felt impelled to go over and help and to witness the good that I knew was really there. So before I knew it, I found myself standing between these two women. Now, at first, they didn't pay any attention to me at all. They just kept arguing over my head. And so I took my hands and I just gently put them on the arms of one of the two women and just clasped her arms just a little bit until she made eye contact with me. And then I said the only thing I could think of to say, which was, you don't have to act this way. I was seeing something in her, something wonderful and godlike. That's it. I was seeing her godlikeness, and it didn't include rage or anger. Well, at first, I think she was surprised that I'd addressed her and just said to me, "What did you say?" And so I said it again. I said, "You don't have to act this way." And the second time I said it, it just seemed like all the anger went out of her and her shoulders relaxed and she stopped fighting and she actually turned and just walked off. And then the other woman saw that there was no fight left, really, and so she turned and walked off, and the people went back to their shopping, and that was it. Now, I'd had no intention of stopping a fight that day, of course. We never intend to do that, but it just kind of followed from what had happened earlier. When I was at that meeting at school, it might sound like grad student drama, but it was really important to me in that moment. And I was just achingly reaching out to God for a solution. And I think we're just extra receptive when you're in that moment of need like that. And I was ready to abandon guilt and instead just experience more of the good, more of those ideas and insights that made Jesus' healing work possible. And when I tangibly felt it, I couldn't help but take that feeling with me to the grocery store. And there was no way I could be witnessing that healing presence and an angry fight at the same time. And, in that sense, I wasn't the one that stopped the fight at all. I got the enjoyment of watching Christ do the work, watching the ideas do the work. And that all just made the fight utterly unnecessary. The spiritual solution was right there, even when I needed it quickly. And, this is relevant to us today. Maybe some of you have read about or even seen footage of Eugene Goodman. I don't know if that name means anything to you all, but he was that quick thinking, very humble Capitol police officer who led the angry rioters away from Senate chambers, away from where the vice president was being held in safety, to a place where the rioters could be better dealt with, where Officer Goodman had some backup. But he is credited for preventing a violent confrontation and has since been recognized and promoted. I don't know if you haven't seen the footage, you might enjoy seeing his quick thinking. He was certainly inspired and looks like made a huge impact on what could have been a far worse day in our Capitol. Officer Goodman might not use these words, but, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was acting on good ideas that came to him from Christ. and the tangible outcome was good and was a universal blessing. The ideas came through quickly, and they likely lessened the impact of the insurrection. So these ideas can come to us quickly when they need to as well. Now, some of you might be thinking, I don't know, there's no divine, perfect reality here and now. There's no presence helping me to see it. And maybe some would say this infinite, loving source of ideas is just imagination. Or you might say, oh, well, maybe there is such a thing, but it's not something that I can experience. And judging by the greater draw these days to atheism and agnosticism, and a lot of focus on materialism, that's something plenty of people may think. I know that. And I can understand that. I also have had to kind of reason through doubt and skepticism. I mean, if we're going to look to something for help, we want that something to be real. Ultimately, it's up to each one of us to investigate for ourselves. But speaking for myself, I can't deny that I get inspired in ways that come to me independently of the limiting thoughts that are based only on the surface appearance of things, especially when I get really quiet in thought and let the ideas bubble up. And I know I'm not the only one that does this. Others have talked about this too, this phenomenon of being inspired when you're doing something quiet that might not require a lot of thought, like taking a shower or riding your bike or something. Ideas that aren't just driven by what our eyes and ears are telling us come to all of us. Good, original ideas. And they have a source. And we might call the source different things. I would call it Christ. Divine mind reaching us through Christ. And anybody can read more about that or see how that can impact their life by looking at the ideas of Christian Science in the Bible and in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. We're coming close to the end of the hour here. This went very quickly. Let me just say that if we ever are feeling stuck and we've looked back at the good ideas that we've talked about today, we've tried being humble and hungering and thirsting after righteousness and trusting the ideas that come to us, but still feel stuck, we might just take a minute or two to address what the Bible refers to as the accuser, or what else does it, the tempter. That voice, that tries to tell us that we're stuck, or especially that we're guilty, doesn't have any power. But it's important for us to realize that. It's important for us to realize that that voice doesn't have any power, because once we do that, we're free to listen to the ideas that are coming to us directly from God. And I think, I know we're a little close to the end, but I think I would like to share one last example with you because it has to do with uprooting old thoughts so that we can be newly inspired by ideas from God. Actually, before I do that, let me share a little information and then we'll finish. For dessert, we'll have this last testimony that I want to share. But I mentioned that this lecture was sponsored by First Church of Christ Scientist, Nashville, Tennessee. And if you want information about that local branch, if you're in the Nashville area and you're interested, or if you just want to learn more about Christian Science, and especially how you might get a copy of the book Science and Health, this book that I've mentioned a couple times by Mary Baker Eddy, you can go to this branch's website, this church's website, and I'm going to try and hold this so you can see it well. It's christiansciencenashville.org, and you can also look them up on Facebook. And then if you have any questions about the lecture itself, you can email me directly, melaniewalbergcs@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you, particularly if you have a question about the lecture. Okay, so one more testimony here. This is special to me because it's a healing that my husband had recently. It was a breakthrough healing for him. For years, he'd had severely varicose legs. They were to the point that, they were unattractive, certainly, and uncomfortable, and noticeable enough that when we would try and go through security at the airport, TSA would actually pat him down, thinking that he had things taped to his legs underneath his pants. But my husband was really making concerted efforts to try and uproot these unnecessary thoughts, to be consistently free from them. And when he did that, he just, like I said, gave God audience, gave Christ audience. And in that time, some burdensome thoughts of his were uncovered. Um, he realized that he'd been feeling an unnecessary sense of responsibility to make everything just right for his family and the people around him and in his own life. And that's not so bad, but uncovering that helped him realize that it was really God that was maintaining his life. That was such a reassuring idea. My husband didn't have to initiate his relationship to God. Actually, he was on the receiving end. He was the humble recipient of these good God-based ideas and blessings. And like I said, I know that's a very simple idea, but it worked in my husband in a very profound way. And in a short time, the entire condition, which is considered incurable, was completely faded away, including the pain associated with it. I mean, it was probably one of the most visibly dramatic healings that our family has seen. It really made a big impact on my kids. It made a big impact on me, frankly. We're so grateful for that undeniable and yet totally natural example of God's care in our lives. And it's always ideas from God that bring this kind of reconstruction in our lives and show us what's true. So thank you all for spending this time with me talking about ideas from God and how they stir something new and exciting in us. The great example that Christ Jesus gave us is our very best to look at. We can continue asking, what would Jesus do? And Mary Baker Eddy's life work, Science and Health, gives us tools and understanding to use these ideas. So let's do this together. The world is ready for it. Let's let God's ideas work in us. And let's watch love's ideas do the work and love the blessing and healing that they bring to us and to everyone around us. Thanks again to Nashville, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you for joining me.